Women in Western Balkans remain underrepresented no matter what sphere we're talking about. Whether it be the media or decision-making policies, there's not enough women that are going to represent their fellow women in these processes. There is a huge pay gap in favor of men, of course. Still not many actions are taken to reduce any of these problems that are happening in the society that we live in. And this is a global issue. We heard in other episodes of YouthSquad that this is actually quite common, not only in Serbia, but in Europe and in the world in general. And obviously, one factor that kind of came up even when I was thinking about this episode and what angle I should take while presenting this topic was that media have a huge influence on this, and media are one of the biggest factors that influence how we think and what we think about certain things and why we think those things. And whatever you do, you're surrounded by content, you're surrounded by the media, and if the media does a certain job in a certain way, you will be influenced and you will be directed throughout the world in that manner. You will be kind of your life will be kind of dictated by the media. So today, in today's episode of YouthSquad, I have Anja. She's a journalism student, but she also is active in organizations that are doing the work of media monitoring and, are talking about how important it is to have objective media workers that are doing the ethical work that is representing social, diversities in the righteous way. Welcome, Anja. Thank you for being in YouthSquad. How are you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm great, actually.
Yeah,
thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm quite good. I'm quite happy and eager to talk about this topic, to be honest, because every day I open the newspapers or I scroll through Instagram. I wonder what pictures do we get to see, how these pictures are painted in order for us to see certain things in a certain way. And so I have a quick question before we begin for you, what is the picture of women in the media? Whether it be, traditional media or, social media, just general, how are women represented in the media? In the Western Balkans, of course.
I would begin by saying that first of all, women are underrepresented in the media. Mm-hmm. So there is obviously 50% of women in our societies, and in the media it's much, much less women and much more men that we see, whether as not journalists or just media workers, or they're people they're interviewing, their interviewees. Or just generally the subject of the reporting. So women in Serbia, the latest data is that women make up around 20% of media content, and globally in the world it's very similar, so it's around 25%, so just slightly better.
Mm-hmm. So it's still half of the women that we have in our society is kind of not represented in the media. If we look at the percentage, 50% of population, of world's population is women, and then only 25% of the content is actually for the women. It should be split in half when we look at it based on the data that we have around the population and so on.
Exactly. So that's the first. The main, I would say, thing that dictates how women are represented. So the main thing that should be
taken into consideration.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So basically, they are underrepresented, but when they are represented, for example, when there is an article about women's issues, women's rights, women's lives, just generally, not even something that's socially active or socially engaged, just, simple storytelling about a certain woman. In those situations, how is a woman represented?
Yes, so when, especially in Serbia and in the Western Balkans, usually women are either represented as victims of violence, which is on one hand positive because we have seen in the past few years more and more articles and news about violence against women, which is a very important topic, and it's very important that we are talking about it. But it's also not very good that women are only represented as victims, because this is also playing into patriarchal gender roles and so on. So they're either represented as victims of violence or as celebrities, pop culture persons who are singers or whatever such
performers. So basically, it's either or. It's like extremes of two. It's extremes of one spectrum. Like you're either a victim that's quite sad and asks for some kind of solidarity with this woman, or you're this powerful woman who earns a lot and is very popular and does something that's quite traditionally acceptable for a woman to do.
Exactly, and I wouldn't say they're always represented as powerful. They're more when they're represented in that for entertainment. It's usually their looks. So it's usually they're pretty, they're wearing certain outfits, gowns, makeup, and so on. It's always about their looks and not as much about what they do. Even when they're singers, they don't talk about their music. They talk about
what they dressed last night.
Exactly. And they face sexualization, obviously, objectification, and so on. So it's usually these two extremes. And what we don't see is that we don't see women experts talking about relevant topics in the media. So when journalists and media workers invite experts for their expert opinion, it's usually men, and women are way less represented as experts in the media.
So basically, the representation of women is quite shallow in the media. Basically, women media workers don't actually dive into the topic in order to do it justice, in order to create a story that's actually worth reading, in a sense where it's gonna actually represent the reality of a certain woman that they are describing. For example, whether it be a pop, culture performer, or someone in entertainment industry, whether it be someone in medicine, or someone in just someone who has a normal, regular 9-to-5 job and stuff like that. So it's a shallow representation, and even there is no representation, but when there is representation, it's shallow, and it leads to certain stereotypes and misconceptions that we kind of then build up on these stories from the media, that we read in the media and we see in the media. So how are women generally represented? Are they represented as this, housewives, that caregivers, usually the ones that are supposed to stay at home, cook lunch, and wait for their husbands? It's quite one-dimensional.
It is absolutely, and it's especially true. I was more talking about informative journalism, but especially in other types of media regarding culture, so like movies, TV shows, and so on. When we think of that as media as well, which it very much is media, and it's very much influential, it's a very, very stereotypical representations of patriarchal gender roles, as you said, and women are painted as only like mothers and housewives, and not as how can I say, full people, basically, who have their families and work and many very complex lives, I would say. It's a never-ending circle or a cycle where media content is based on stereotypes about women and about gender in general, and then it's again reinforced into society. So these stereotypes come from society, and then the media reinforce them, and then they come back even stronger.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't you can't really escape this reality. It's just you are born into it, you listen about it, you grow into it, and then you also share it with others because you are a victim of these stereotypes. You kind of are influenced enough to influence further, so to say.
Exactly. And it's what you said at the beginning when you were introducing the topic. The media really has a huge effect on our lives, and I'm not sure if we even realize just how big of an effect it has on our daily habits, routine, our ways of thinking, and so on.
And what do you think has to happen in order for that to change? Because you said that it's a never-ending cycle. Who breaks the cycle?
Well,
what breaks the cycle?
That's a very difficult question, but I would say that one of the solutions is education of journalists, which is, I would say, kind of beginning to happen in Serbia and in the Western Balkans. I'm focusing on Serbia because I'm from Serbia, but in the Western Balkans in general, I think journalists are more aware of not only topics regarding gender equality, but also other maybe human rights and so on topics. And they're more aware of this, and they're implementing it in their work. So we have definitely for the past few years seen more content that has been talking about these important topics. First of all, gender equality, as I said, violence against women and such. But it's also, I believe, there's a slight improvement in the way they report on these topics.
But do you when you read an article, these articles do tackle these topics, but do they tackle it from a solution-oriented approach, or do they just say that there is a problem without actually offering mechanism? Because media, it affects people, but it also is the kind of change maker. It can bring change to society. So if they introduce some mechanisms and people like it, it's gonna stick. It's like a trend. It's gonna stick with the society. They're gonna take on it. So do you think that these articles that you mentioned that are now or this slight improvement in the media is actually in the direction of solution-oriented journalism, or just simply stating the facts?
At this point, I think it's usually just stating the facts, and we don't really see solution-based journalism, especially regarding this topic. Most media even fail, especially mainstream media and tabloids, even fail to recognize it as a societal problem sometimes, especially when reporting about violence against women. It's always in mainstream media and tabloids reported, or not, I wouldn't say always, but mainly and usually, as a specific case of this woman being murdered or a victim of sexual violence or whatever. But it's always like an incident and not a societal problem. But we see some media that actually recognize this as a societal problem and introduce experts to actually explain and educate the public on this topic, which is important and which I believe or I hope there would be more of in the future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a long way to there, but I also I'm with you in this hope that this will change accordingly, because it's quite important that media bring these topics into the society in order to introduce them to this never-ending cycle which you mentioned. Because if we, instead of stereotypes, juggle with change or with certain ideas of change, it can also be quite contagious. It can stick within the society, and this can also be a positive way to bring change. What about the authorities? What about the institutions that are in place in order to control how media report on women? What happens when an incident happens? What happens when media don't do their job ethically, and it's quite visible, and you as an individual know that? And what happens when you want to do something about it?
Well, there are institutions that you can contact regarding unethical journalism, which is very common when talking about reporting on violence against women. But it's very hard. I wouldn't say they have huge influence. I cannot talk about all the Western Balkans because it's quite different in each country. But in Serbia, it's the Press Council, which is a self-regulatory body. So they don't really have they do
governmental.
Yeah, exactly. So they can't introduce fines or anything. They are basically just there as an
regulatory system,
basically system to represent integrity of the media. And we also have the regulatory body for electronic media in Serbia, which has much more authority and much more resources, basically, to fine these media or prosecute them, yes, but they do not do it, and they fail to even recognize problems in the media and not to go as far out as to
actually do something. I mean, I believe that from what I've read about this and from what I got informed about, it seems that these type of mechanisms and institutional mechanisms, as well as these self-regulatory bodies implemented in order to put in place in order to protect the victims of the media, which is the whole society, are usually quite passive and lethargic, quite ignorant to the real issue at hand, and quite ignorant. I think, they're quite avoidant when it comes to these issues, which is quite sad to see, because if the media isn't educated, we're again talking about this cycle, because it's all about this vicious cycle that if media isn't educated enough, there's no one to educate them, there's no one to sanction them. It's just a complete mess and chaos without any proper regulation that can actually lead this situation to something that is under the power of some rule, of some law. And that's quite dangerous, because we can witness a lot of harmful narratives that are all around us and that are targeting especially those who are fighting for human rights and those who are asking for basic human rights in the Western Balkans, which is quite concerning and scary.
It is, yeah, and I would say institutions are very important, and we cannot just ignore them and say that they're not working, but we should encourage them to become stronger. Also, in the Western Balkans, the rule of law that you mentioned is in general a problem. So this affects the media laws and regulations as well.
Yeah. But when we go back to, the beginning of everyone's journalism career, which is where you are right now, whether you want to work as a journalist or, as a media worker or something above it, you're still in the topic of the media. You're finishing your studies and, you're like looking out to the career path that you want to create, and what are the directions that you want to take? Not you personally, maybe as much as, just generally, what are the thoughts of an average journalism student in the Western Balkans? Like, where do they want to go? What do they want to do? Like, are they aware of the reality that they're going to be faced with after they finish the studies? Do studies reflect the reality that they're going to go into? What does it look like?
I wouldn't say that the studies reflect the reality of how it is to work in the media today. But I believe my colleagues and friends who are starting their careers as young journalists are very much aware of how the media work, because they start very, very young. So we pretty much all, even while we're studying on our first or second year, get involved in media and work as journalists and learn from working. So I think they're very aware. And I think they're doing a good job, and they're very also aware of other important social issues such as gender equality. I would say more than maybe our older colleagues. But yeah, it's tough to work in the media because and it's journalists struggle with being underpaid and and working in media where in a country or in general in our region where it's not the best or not the most free media scene.
So do you think it's, I mean, you mentioned that it's not easy being a journalist in the Western Balkans, but do you think it's, it comes from the fact that, you know, I mean, do you think it's not easy for the journalists who actually want to do ethical work? Like journalists that or media workers in general that have their values, proper values. I mean, all values are proper, whether it doesn't matter how you look. I mean, it just matters how you look at them and from which perspective. But, you know, like liberal, ethical values that you want to implement in your work. Do you think it's hard for those kind of journalists or for all journalists as a whole? Like, if someone even has the correct, you know, like mindset and wants to do the right job, but is underpaid, do you think they're going to be influenced by it and start doing the, you know, the slacky job? Or
I would say almost all journalists in Serbia are underpaid, but it's especially hard for people who are striving towards ethical journalism and respecting all journalistic standards, because most media in Serbia don't respect them, and we can see that from the press council that I mentioned. They publish these like yearly and monthly research or monitoring reports, exactly, that say that it depends on how much, but almost all relevant media in Serbia often breach the code of journalists of Serbia.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's quite saddening to hear. But I mean, yes. So this is the situation that we have at hand. This is what, you know, what the reality is. But what do we have to do in order to you know, like influence other journalists? I mean, obviously the problem is that the journalists who want to do the proper job are not paid enough, and then they struggle to get funds, and that's how, you know, most media outlets actually go into that easier path, so to say, towards, you know, some sustainable funding from the state or something like that, and then get influenced by the state and by their funders in order to, you know, sell the agenda, to somehow make up for the money that they received in the first place. So it's like, again, a vicious cycle of funds, and, you know, in the media it all seems to be connected.
Yes, and even it's connected even with the topic of gender equality and women representation in the media, because when you're working in an environment such as the media scene in Serbia and Western Balkans, where it's where you are not only underpaid, but you are not always free to write maybe what you would, and you cannot always respect all ethical standards of journalism. It's hard to focus on important topics that is women in media. So yeah, journalists, I think, struggle with that even when they have the awareness of the issue.
Yeah.
So about the issue.
So if some topic is not hot enough for media to get clicks and to, you know, get the people to buy their newspapers or, you know, something like that, it's not gonna. If it's not gonna sell, it's not gonna be written about, so to say. I mean, not necessarily in all media outlets, but most of them that need to, you know, basically survive by selling and, you know, like by satisfying the needs of the society. If some topic is not hot enough, for example, violence against women, it's not gonna be written about, which really does affect of the media environment in general and what information we actually receive from the media.
Yes, generally I would say that's the situation. But I think they're great journalists in Serbia that work really hard and actually manage to, through all of that circumstances that they're giving, they manage to speak and write about topics such as violence against women or gender equality,
and to actually have the balanced and the proper media coverage on these topics, and to avoid victim blaming narratives, and to avoid stereotyping of women, and to just generally talk about women outside of these hot topics at the moment, but just report on their lives, just so because
maybe it's controversial, but I would say that gender equality and even talking about women and what they go through in the media has become more of a hot topic recently, and I think that's very good. I mean, it's a slow process,
and it's maybe not the right formula for the result that we want to get. In a sense, we don't want to make something trendy. We don't want to make violence against women sell in order to talk about it. But if that's what it takes, it's still okay-ish. Because it's at least talked about, you know what I mean? You don't have to agree. I mean, we can,
Well, generally, it's important to have, if you want to have a social debate about an issue or a topic, that this is the way to do it. And seeing more and more content in the media about, for example, violence against women, means that it will be talked about in your house, in your family, in your school, on your job, and in the institutions, in the parliament, in the government. So it's all,
And what media have also the power to do, and that's one thing that has happened throughout the last year in the Western Balkans, but especially in Serbia. They create this public pressure. They create this atmosphere in which people unite around certain topics, and the women's rights has been the topic that people have been uniting. For example, in Kosovo, there was this protest around women's rights once a couple of women were experienced sexual violence, which was really important, and media played an active role in those protests, because they were actually supporting and backing up people who were coming out on the streets and actually speaking their minds out. Same thing happened in Serbia with Informer when they posted this controversial interview with a serial rapist, convicted serial rapist, and actually media did kind of of course, some media trigger it in a negative way, but still, it is a trigger that can create public pressure and that public pressure can create, change, concrete change.
Absolutely. I wouldn't say it's supporting or not supporting the cause, but it's definitely just reporting on it, just providing space in the media for such topics, and that's what it is. It's putting them on the agenda, and then we can see real change.
I mean, what you mentioned in the beginning, media have to report. Women make up 50% of the population. Reporting on women's issues is in public interest, because that's half of the society we have. We can't ignore half of the society and only talk about the other half as the first one doesn't exist. We have to actually have proper balanced out,
equal representation.
Equal representation and proper equal representation, because if one thing can be drawn as a conclusion from the Western Balkans media reporting on certain issues, especially in women's issues, is that not every representation is good representation. Sometimes representation, and unfortunately in the Western Balkans that's the case quite often, it does go in another direction, and it happens that sometimes many women would think, just don't represent me. Don't represent me. I'd rather I'm not here, because I've heard it many times. Women tend to avoid going to TV shows, going to TV debates, live debates, because they're not quite sure whom they'll be faced with, because quite often these TV shows don't create environment in which women are welcome, and then if you don't get the women's perspective from a woman, most likely you'll get it wrong. And so that also goes into the cycle that we mentioned like 100 times during this episode.
Yes, and it's very connected to the stereotypes that we have already mentioned, because women experts, for example, when they do get a chance to go to a TV show and talk about what they do, they not only have to think about that, but they also have to think about how they look like, because that is the first thing that will be judged by the journalists, the media workers, and the public that is watching.
And there's a huge chance that they will be discredited based on
the looks.
Yes, and based on the looks, based on the sexual history of the woman, or just generally, like the job history or any type of background that this woman comes with. It's quite often that you have to have but it's quite impossible also to have a complete clean background that no one can actually take up something against, to put something from your past against you. Sure, and that's quite a burden for women, and no wonder that it's quite hard for women to be equally represented, not only because the media workers don't do their job, but also because the environment is such as in which they are not welcome.
I agree. I think most women feel the burden of that, even if they don't experience it necessarily in a situation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would finish this episode here, because I believe that we really tackled some important topics, and we raised some quite crucial questions that need to be answered in order to understand what the media picture of women is in the Western Balkans, and what needs to change in order to, because we really mapped some of the problems quite directly. And I think if you address those problems, most likely you'll have a better representation of women, and most likely you will have a more balanced out, equal media environment, which is extremely important and crucial to have a society in which women are not discriminated against or frowned upon just because they are women. I want to thank you, Anja, for being in this episode. I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode of YouthSquad, and I hope you tune in for the next episode as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to YouthSquad. My name is Maria. The YouthSquad podcast series is recorded under a small-scale project in the field of youth called Voicehood of Youth, which will cover 4 topics: human rights, gender equality, European multiculturalism, inclusion and diversity, and active participation. The project is implemented within the Erasmus Plus program and is financed by the Swedish National Agency. Thank you for tuning in, and make sure you stay tuned for another episode.